There are 35 signs that Jesus performed that are recorded in the Gospels. John is only going to focus on 7. And when you think of all of the miracles John could have selected, and he's only going to focus on 7, right? He said many other signs Jesus did. And of all of those to choose from, John focuses on a miracle about Jesus providing refreshments at a wedding party. Now, marriage and the marriage feast was one of the most important events in an individual's life. In fact, there's 2 parables that even use marriage as a basis for what they're trying to use as an illustration. In Matthew 22, right, the kingdom and the wedding garments, those that were unprepared were cast out into utter darkness. In Matthew chapter 24, the 10 virgins who were waiting to go into the wedding feast, they were waiting for the bridegroom but were unprepared. And Jesus is part of the community around him. He's celebrating God's institution of marriage in a festivity in the bridegroom's home. So in John chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, it says that on the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." So this takes place on the 3rd day. So this is 3 days after the events in chapter 1. So remember, we started off John being questioned in day 1. On day 2, we have John's testimony that was given. Day 3 was focused around the 2 disciples. Day 4, Philip and Nathanael. And then now this is 3 days after that, the 3rd day after that. So this is now day 7 in John's narrative. Now from the wording here, it appears that Mary played an important role. Perhaps these people were relatives of hers. What we see is, though, Joseph is not mentioned at any point, which leads many people to conclude that at this point he has died. Now Jesus was her oldest son, and Mary comes to Jesus because there is a problem. The bridegroom's family is out of wine. Now in that culture, it would be incredibly embarrassing for the family, right? The festivities were multi-day events. In fact, many writings say that perhaps the family could even be held liable, that they could be sued for not properly providing for and preparing for the guests. This is not a way to start off a marriage. And so Jesus replies, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, the way this is translated, it seems kind of blunt, right? But the term is probably more respectful of just the word woman. It's probably like today we use the word ma'am or madam. But what he says is, woman. The NIV translates it, "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" One of the things we know is he was not being disrespectful. Because in John chapter 19, as Jesus is dying on the cross, he sees John next to his mother and he says, "Woman, behold your son." Certainly one of the most touching scenes in the gospel accounts. And he uses the exact same word, the exact same phrase as he's seeing that she is taken care of. But what Jesus also says is, "My hour has not yet come." And we see this phrase being repeated throughout the book of John. Time and time again, "My hour has not yet come." And in John 17, what we see then is he prays because now his hour has come. Mary is saying they have no wine, right? So she turns to the person that she relies on the most at this point, and that would be her oldest son. And it seems like there is no natural solution to this problem. Now, she knows Jesus was special. Don't know if she knew he had the ability to perform miracles, but perhaps she thought he could do something that nobody else could. But Jesus says, what does your concern have to do with me? He says, I have to answer to a higher authority. There is a timetable that I'm on. And I can't just choose to display myself publicly whenever I choose. You are my mother, but my Father has set an agenda for me in regards to these matters. Family is important, but his relationship to the Father trumped everything. And what we see is she doesn't get mad. She doesn't know what Jesus can or will do, but perhaps she gives one of the best quotes to use out of context ever, and that is, she says to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Certainly good words of advice when we're talking about Jesus. Now there were 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. So you're probably thinking, wait a second, I don't remember reading about this in the Old Testament. And the answer is, you're right. In the Old Testament, only the priests were instructed about ceremonial washings between the altar and the tabernacle. But what happened is, what we see over time is that the Pharisees decided that if the priests needed to wash to be holy, and everyone should be holy. So they wrote all of these instructions of how people should wash before eating. And Mark talks about this. And what we see is that what these water pots then really represent is the old covenant and its inferior means of purification. So Jesus says to them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them to the brim. And he said, now draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. So Jesus tells these servants to fill the water pots with water, draw it out, and give it to the master to drink. These were the water pots that were used for purification, and they did it. Why did they do it? Because Mary had instructed them, whatever he tells you to do, you go do it. So they bring the water to the master of the feast, and he tastes the water that was made wine, and he did not know where it came from. Now the servants knew, because they knew where they drew it out of. They drew it out of the purification containers, right? And the master of the feast called the bridegroom. Now Jesus did not do a public display. The only people that knew were the servants of what had happened. So the master of the feast called the bridegroom. So what was the role of the master of the feast? It was to see that all of the guests were taken care of. But now this is an interesting situation, because he said, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You've kept the good wine until now, right? This is reversed, right? My responsibility is to make sure I'm taking care of the people. Why have you been holding out on me? This is not the way things are supposed to be done. The good is supposed to be served first, and if you run out of the good, then you serve the inferior. You bring whatever you can find, but this is reversed. The inferior has come first, and now the better is replacing it. You kept the best, and you held it to come after the first. So what we see is, this is the beginning of the signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. And he manifested his glory, and his disciples believed on him. This is the beginning. We've seen that before, right? This is how John started off, in the beginning of creation. How many days were in the creation story? 7, right? What is this now? This is the 7th day. The 7th day since John's gospel started recording these events. And it's on the 7th day that Jesus is doing a sign. A sign of what? Well, what did John tell us as he opened up his prologue? Right? All things were made through him, And without him, nothing was made that was made. So what we see is the Creator is turning water to the finest wine. If Jesus wants to change one thing that is not valuable, purification water, and making it into something else that is wonderful, he has the authority to do that. So it's a sign of purification. The law of Moses, the ineffective means of purification, the limited ability to cleanse, versus the grace, the purification that Jesus provides. What did we also see? That the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. We're seeing signs of this in what Jesus is doing. It's a sign of quality. One of the things we see is what came later was better than what was initially given. And it's a sign of quantity. These are 6 pots. Each pot is probably 20 to 30 gallons. So we're talking 3,000 servings of the finest wine that is being brought out. John chapter 10, verse 10, I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. Grace upon grace. And this is an important concept, right? So now what we see is his disciples now believed in him. Not the servants that saw this happen, right? This says his disciples that already believed in him. But now after seeing this, what it says, now they believed in him. Right? What we saw in the prior chapter was they have called him the Messiah, the one who Moses wrote about, the Son of God, the King of Israel. And now what we see is layers of faith. After they saw this, then they believed in him. And that's what we see. This is what the Gospel of John is all about. These have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life. It's not just you believe, but it's that your faith will grow. If Jesus can speak water into wine, he is in control of creation. If he controls creation, he can bring life, and he can change the lives of men. Now after this, what we see is that he went down to Capernaum. He, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples. And they did not stay for 30 days. Right? So he went down to Capernaum. Cana was up in the hilly area. Capernaum was at water level. So even though they're going east, they're going down in terms of elevation. Right? Capernaum becomes a base for Jesus in Galilee. But what it says is they did not stay there many days. They're getting ready to make the trip to go down to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. The Passover was one of 3 major feasts that all Jews expected to travel to Jerusalem to observe. And it was to remember God delivering them from bondage when God passed over their houses that were identified by the blood of the Lamb. So John is going to talk about Jesus going to Jerusalem and what happens when he goes to the temple. He says, Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. So the Jewish people were to offer up sacrifices for Passover, right? And they would travel long distances, and they weren't going to bring animals along with them for their long distances. Instead, what they would do is they would buy them when they got there. And if you traveled to these areas, right, you had to change your money. And they would need to do that so that they could purchase the animals. So what you now have are people selling animals, people exchanging currencies for the Jewish shekels that they would need, right? And Herod's temple took decades to build. And all of this activity was taking place in the courtyard around the temple. This area was commonly referred to as the court of the Gentiles. And think about the animals that would need to be sold to the thousands of visitors, right? How many must have been in that courtyard? And how many money changers to allow the exchanging from all of the surrounding areas? Probably more noisier and hectic than what you would see on a mall or shopping centers on Black Friday. And Jesus sees all of this going on around the temple, and he's not happy. And what we see is he made a whip of cords, and he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the changers' money, and he overturned their tables. Now, you might think about the other Gospels that also talk about Jesus doing this. But when they talk about this, this happens during the final week. And what we see is in John's Gospel, this is happening at the beginning. And I think when you put all the narratives together, what you see is that there's actually two separate events. One at the beginning, where Jesus does this, giving them a chance to change. And then one at the end, where he's disappointed in the fact that they didn't. Now imagine what it sounded like. Sounds of animals, sellers calling out. Imagine what it would have smelled like. Now, is this really a place where people come together to pray? Right? When we say it's time to clean house, that is exactly what Jesus is doing. And so what he says is, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Now when you look back at Malachi, and you look at Malachi, what we see is that it says, behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And that's what John the Baptist was supposed to do. He came to prepare the way. But after that messenger came and began his work of preparing the way, what he says, and then the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and the launderer's soap. He will set as a refiner and a purifier of silver. So he's like the launderer's soap. He's going to cleanse. He's like a refiner's fire. He's going to purify. He says that is the Lord whom you will seek. He's going to be following the messenger that is preparing the way. And that is what he's going to do when he suddenly appears in the temple. He's going to cleanse the temple. He's going to purify his house. And what we see is he said to those, take those things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. And then his disciples remembered what it was written, that zeal for your Father's house has eaten me up. What we see is, this is a quote from Psalm 69. Here David is feeling isolated alone. He said, those who hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of my head. They are mighty who would destroy me, being my enemies wrongfully. And though I've stolen nothing, I still must restore it, because for your sake I have borne reproach. Shame has covered my face. I have become a stranger to my brothers and an alien to my mother's children. Right? He says, I have enemies all around. I am alienated from my people, alienated from my family, alienated from my country. And the reason why this is happening is because of the zeal that I have for God's house. He says, reproach has broken my heart, and I am full of heaviness. I looked for someone to take pity, but there was none, and for comforters, but I found none. They also gave me gall for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. What we see is this is exactly what happened to Jesus on the cross. But then look how he starts to wrap up. He says, "But I am poor and sorrowful. Let your salvation, O God, set me up on high. I will praise the name of God with a song, and I will magnify him with thanksgiving. This also shall please the Lord better than an ox or bull, which has horns and hooves. The humble shall see this and be glad. And you who seek God, your hearts shall live." Right? There's something more important to God than the animals that you bring, and that is the heart that you bring. And Jesus is telling the same thing here. There is more to worshiping God than the animals that they're bringing to sacrifice. It is the heart that they're supposed to be bringing. And with all of this business going on inside the temple, there is no way that people can focus their hearts on God in prayer. So the Jewish people, right, remember John is talked about when he uses this term of the Jews, right? What we see is this always refers to the Jewish leaders, the establishment. So they come to him and they ask, "What sign do you show to us since you do these things?" It's not a sign that we can understand God better, right? What they're asking is, "Show us your credentials." What they should have asked is, should we have turned God's house into something other than a house of prayer? That's the question that they should be asking. But instead, the question that they're asking is, who are you to tell us what to do? It never occurred to them that they might be wrong. Instead, what they want is a sign. They want Jesus to provide credentials that he has authority to tell them what to do. So Jesus replies to them, and he says, "Destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will raise it up." So they said to him, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. This is one of those times where people completely missed what Jesus was talking about. Right? They want a sign. They want his credentials. And what Jesus replies, even his disciples did not really grasp what Jesus was talking about at that time. Remember what John told us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Right? The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. The tabernacle was where God dwelt. The people considered the temple to be the dwelling place of God. What we see is, though, the real dwelling place of God was not the tabernacle. It was not the temple. It was not any building, but where God was dwelling with us was in a person. Jesus was the temple. Jesus was the dwelling place of God. Jesus was where God was walking among his creation and interacting with his people, because he was with God and he was God. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, right, John has already given away what's going to happen right at the very beginning. He's telling us the ending. Why? Because at this point, everything will be pointing to what will eventually happen and what will be the ultimate sign, right? Jesus said, "I am going to do this," right? "You're going to destroy the temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." And after this happened, right, then they believed the scripture which Jesus had said. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them, because he knew all men, and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. These people were all believing the signs, but they were not listening to the message. And Jesus knows their heart. that they're not going to be receptive to his teachings when he starts laying them out. A faith that is just based on signs. Just believing in his name, what we're going to see, is not enough. It's going to take more than just believing the signs. It's going to take believing in him. It's going to take a complete commitment, and that is what we're going to see portrayed in the Gospel of John. A willingness to accept the testimony that's given and to submit and follow what he demands. Now this also now sets the stage for chapter 3 and Jesus' interaction with Nicodemus.